This is an oral history interview being conducted as part of the LGBT Unitarian Voices project of the General Assembly of Unitarian and Free Christian Churches. The interviewer is Lizzie Kingston Harrison, Congregational Connections Lead for the General Assembly. The interviewee is Reverend Dr. Anne Peart, first openly lesbian Unitarian minister in the UK, former principal of Unitarian College Manchester, information officer at Essex Hall, former GA president and honorary member of the General Assembly. The interview is being conducted online via Zoom with the interviewer in Suffolk and the interviewee at home in Manchester. And today's date is Friday, the 10th of February, 2023. And thank you, Anne, for being here with me. My first question is really, we were hoping you could tell us why you're interested in being part of the LGBT Unitarian Voices project and why it's important to you.
I guess it's important to me because I've been a part of the Unitarian lesbian and gay story for the last 30 years at least, 40 years, I think probably, or even longer. So I'm interested that we don't lose this part of our Unitarian history.
Thank you. I'm moving on to question 2. Please, can you tell us your story in your own words? Thank you.
I was born in the Greater Manchester area, lived in Hyde, of a typical Unitarian family, in that I was christened in chapel. I went to Sunday school, I think, for 1 year when I was about 5, but then the family did other things at weekends. So I knew which chapel we did not go to. And it was an aunt who told me more about Unitarianism and took me to her chapel when I stayed with her on occasions. I first became involved when I was about 12 and went to Manchester High School, which was a school which had been, Manchester High School for Girls, which was a school which had been founded by a variety of the great and good of Manchester, including Unitarians, and had in its constitution that no pupil or staff should be penalised because of their religion or lack of it. So it was a school which had quite a diverse population, including quite a lot of Jewish girls. And we always had our RE lessons the last thing on a Friday so that the Jewish girls could go home early in winter to observe the Sabbath. And our form teachers took RE and were not specialists. So they were very easy, almost willing to be diverted from the syllabus into discussion. I was the only Unitarian in the class, as far as I knew in the school. So I had to know enough about Unitarians to be able to keep my corner up, but there was nobody there to contradict if I got it wrong. So I started going to chapel. I got my mother to take me the first time, but then I went on my own. It was almost, you might say, my teenage rebellion, because this is something I did, but the rest of my close family didn't. And I quite enjoyed it, but was perhaps just beginning to get a little bit bored by the time I got to the age of 18, when the minister, Harry Smith, was asked quite out of the blue if I'd like to be May Queen. Now, the May Queen of a chapel in the northwest of England is very different from the Rose Queen. The Rose Queen does all the social bits. The May Queen is the chapel queen, not the Sunday school queen, and it's quite a serious ministerial job, if you like, helping them minister with junior church, which took place before the main adult service in the morning, and then taking the flowers from the communion table round to the sick and elderly and housebound on the Sunday evening. So I found as during the year went on, that first of all, I was given rather more responsibility, because this is a time when Mr. Smith was Minister of the General Assembly, so wasn't there more Sundays than usual. So I actually took junior chapel by myself, completely untrained, unqualified, but I just copied what he did and it seemed to work and there were no disasters. And my Sunday evenings got longer and longer as I really enjoyed chatting with particularly really interesting and courageous old ladies. So in a way, this gave me my first sense of ministry. And I even took a service. It was an evening service, so less prestigious than the morning one. But I preached on Albert Schweitzer, and I still got that sermon somewhere, and it's actually not too bad. Again, completely untrained, but copied what the minister did, and it seemed to work. I then went off to Cambridge. I have been described as the most naive 19-year-old who ever went to Cambridge, but perhaps that's another story. But the Unitarian Church in Cambridge was led by Reverend Dr. Stuart Carter, who was a very charismatic figure, and I really enjoyed being part of that congregation. We had a little undergraduate society, but it was also the only place where I met people who were not part of the university. And there were discussions at homes at the minister's house every Tuesday evening in term time. So I really became part of that community. And I think even served on the congregation committee in my final year. So this got me completely involved in the Unitarian community. And I joined the Foy Society, which was for young adults at that time, started going to their national conference, so got involved in doing Unitarian things on a national level. After graduating, I got a second-class degree, a full rowing blue and a fiancé, so I reckon that wasn't really a bad haul. I went off to London to do an education diploma and then got married and settled in Hampshire. I knew nothing about lesbianism at that stage, and it never occurred to me that I might turn into one. I was reasonably happily married. It never occurred to me to be anything else, really. I began to take services more often and got involved in with the congregation on the district life. And at some stage, I think I served on the youth committee of the General Assembly. So I was getting very embodied in the movement. I had wondered about ministry training, about being a minister during my undergraduate time, but reckoned that I needed some experience of life before I could minister to people older than me. And I guess it's a question of be careful what you asked for, because by the time I got to the age of 40 in London, I had I had given birth to 4 children, 3 of whom died from different illnesses. I had been divorced. So by that time, I had accumulated a good deal of experience of life. At the age of 36, I had never thought that I would go back to work again, but after divorce, it was a necessity. So I went back to part-time teaching while looking after 2 children, and found that really it was not what I wanted to do. So although in those days it wasn't possible to train for the full status ministry on a part-time basis, I discussed this with Roy Smith, who was the General Secretary of the General Assembly at the time. And he said, well, apply for it and see what happens, and I'll support you. So I did. I knew 5 of the 6 interview panel members quite well, because I'd been on a variety of General Assembly committees and working parties, and had edited Zet at the General Assembly and all sorts of things. So people thought they knew me. I didn't say that after my divorce, I had spent 3 years re-examining who I was, and that included in experimenting more with my sexuality, with, I guess it would be called polyamory now, but in those days it was sort of friends with benefits. So I knew that I had women friends and the friendship included sex. But this didn't come up in interview, and I didn't see why I should bring it up. So I was allowed to start training. I remember one interesting question from the one person on the panel I didn't know personally. I was known as a feminist. I was on the Feminist Theology Working Party. And she slipped in the question, literally, I was going out the door, does God have to be female? And my instinctive action was, of course not. But I do remember that as being one of the more interesting bits of the process. So I trained for the ministry while living in North London, doing 2 days a week at Oxford and doing a counselling course locally and teaching for 2 days to earn enough money to survive on, and looking after my 2 children. I needed a job. I candidated for one ministry in the London area, and much to several people's surprise, came a close second, but didn't get it, which was quite fortunate, because I think that congregation would have eaten me alive at that stage. But there was a post of information officer going up at Unitarian headquarters. So I applied for it on the understanding that I would do that 4 days a week. And the district minister, who was Sydney Knight, promised he would find me a part-time ministry, because I wanted to be a minister, and I didn't want to do a job which I could have done without the ministerial training. So I ended up being 4/5 information officer and 1/5 minister at Lewisham on the south side of London. And I think the congregation and I colluded in doing a reasonable, sort of minimal job there. I didn't do anything in the community, but I was over there once a fortnight, taking the service and doing any visiting that needed to be done. And in a way, that congregation helped to train me as a minister, though without the 20 odd years of good congregational experience that had gone before, I don't know whether the training would have been adequate. But having been congregational officer, having been on various congregational committees, I did know Unitarian congregations and the movement pretty well by that stage.
So I'm thinking back to 1963, actually, which was quite early in your story. And I know at that time, the General Assembly that year passed a resolution inviting Unitarian churches, in light of what they called changing moral standards, to read the book Towards a Quaker View of Sex. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that book, either from the time or perhaps later. And I know you then later talked to the author of that book as well.
In 1963, I was taking the Inquirer, but I did not go to the annual meetings. I don't think I started going to 65 or even 66. So I have no direct memories of that. But later on, much later on, I had an interesting discussion with David Blamires, who had been part of that early publication. And we compared notes on the histories of our different movements. And there were times when it looked as if the Quakers were ahead, like that early publication. But then some Unitarian congregations started things like intergroup, and which we'll talk about later perhaps, and started doing same-sex blessings, which the Quakers didn't do till a lot later. And this was purely down to the difference in our organization, that the Quakers have a very tight national structure, and they debate something thoroughly, and when they decide to do something, well, then most of their meetings are willing to do it. With Unitarians, of course, the individual congregation is the unit which makes decisions. So some of our congregations could make decisions early on about being active in the lesbian and gay movement, but many others didn't.
The other thing that struck me when you talked about your interview for ministry training, of course, you said they didn't ask you about your sexual orientation. Did you get the feeling at that time that there were ministers in gay relationships, and perhaps it just was something that was an open secret that wasn't talked about? And is that the same in society at the time? Is it something that is happening, but just no one mentions it formally? Or is it just something that isn't really being discussed at all?
Well, at that time, I was a member of Golders Green Unitarians, and that congregation was very active in promoting justice for gay and lesbian people. So it wouldn't have been an issue at Golders Green, at least I didn't think it would. And I don't think I was very aware nationally. I do know of ministers who had, male ministers who had retired, who had come out publicly in 1977 when Golders Green had a resolution at the General Assembly. And I must talk about that next, I guess. I had a feeling that if I brought it up, it may present problems. But I was known as a single parent with 2 small children who was a feminist. And I think I had the sympathy vote because it was my ex-husband who left me. And I guess I didn't really want to disrupt that too much.
Thank you. I'll let you pick up the story in your own time. I think you were going to talk about intergroup and the 1977 resolution, so please.
Yes. We moved from Hampshire to northwest London in 1969 and became members of both Kensington and Golders Green congregations because we knew both ministers at a national level. Golders Green was then had Keith Gilley as a minister, and he became very involved in work for gay and lesbian rights. There was attached to the congregation a group called Intergroup, which had, I think, first been started at Lewisham by the Reverend Tony Cross, and then Keith brought it to Golders Green. It was a meeting of both gay, as we said then, and straight people to discuss matters of mutual interest on a basis of equality. And nobody was asked their orientation. So it was a very interesting group that was supported at Golders Green by some very respectable members of the Women's League. And I remember one very beautiful young woman who was actually a young widow saying that she loved to go to the meetings because when she came into a room, the men's heads did not turn. And I suppose it was a place where I first knowingly met gay men and lesbians, and got to know Dudley Cave and Bernard Williams quite well. Keith Gilley and Dudley Cave, as his assistant, started performing same-sex blessings in the church. And it was known as a gay-friendly place. I guess that's all I want to say about it at this stage. Or apart from the 1977 resolution that went to the General Assembly meetings. There were two resolutions on homosexuality that year. One, a general one, asking for a more liberal approach. And the other one was specifically directed to the ministry. It asked that our ministry be open to people regardless of sex, race, or sexual orientation. So I suppose I could have used that in my ministry application, but I didn't think to. Now, that resolution was proposed by Golders Green, and my then husband, David, proposed it. It was seconded by Joyce Pearson, who was as respectable as you could get. She was a minister. She was the daughter of a minister, a stalwart of the Women's League, both nationally and in the congregation. She was, I think, probably still secretary of she said it had been secretary of the congregation. And it was this, I think, espousal of the cause by members of the Women's League, which helped enormously. The night before the resolution came up, I have rather vague memories of a late night meeting to discuss some of the issues. And two, I think that by then retired male ministers came out as gay. And received a very sympathetic, had a very sympathetic reception on the whole, though I do remember at least one male minister being very distressed to find out that friends and colleagues had been gay and he hadn't known, which I thought was a sad but interesting comment on the situation. But the resolution went forward the next day and I think was passed unanimously. So although there was some hostility, letters to the Inquirer and so on, it became firm Unitarian General Assembly policy. Another event that happened before I applied for the ministry was the advent of a blue leaflet called Birth, Marriage and Death, put out by the General Assembly. And it does say that among other services, some ministers might be prepared to consider blessing a same-sex union. This was brought up at the General Assembly meetings, and some people objected very much to this. They felt that it did not show our movement in a good light. So, as far as I remember, there was a somewhat acrimonious exchange, and it was agreed that the leaflet should be destroyed. And then on the last night, there was the usual social, which in those days was much more of a sort of homegrown effort with skits by the women, the Young People's League and so on. And I remember Keith Gilley coming on as a rather seedy looking man in a dirty raincoat. And he opened the coat as a flasher might, and it was lined with blue leaflets. And this enabled us to laugh at ourselves. And then the next day, it was announced that there had been a compromise, and it was agreed that the blue leaflets would not be destroyed, but they would not be on display. And they would be available for any congregation that asked for them. So when I became information officer in the 1986, the blue leaflets were still around in the basement. And we did surreptitiously put them at the back of one of the racks, I remember at one stage, and nobody commented. And I seem to remember, though you'd have to check with Ingrid to be sure, that at one stage, Roy Smith, the General Secretary, said to Ingrid that he was happy for her to put she was my assistant, he would be happy for her to put the leaflets out. And if anybody complained, he would reprimand her over a glass of wine. And as far as I know, nobody ever did complain. So attitudes were certainly changing during that time. Where to go next? Oh, yes. Soon after I started my ministry at Golders Green, I met and fell in love with a woman through a wonderful organization called Women in Theology. This was a radical feminist movement that had been set up initially by Anglicans to provide theological training for ministers, for women, so that when they were eventually called to the priesthood, they would have some theological training. But it soon branched out into doing house services using feminist material and so on, and discussion groups and so on. And it had quite a high proportion of lesbians. So I met quite a few really good friends through that group, including Grace. And once we got together, it was obvious that I needed to come out officially in the movement. I remember giving a paper at the 1990 Ministers' Conference on liberation theology. And somewhere I think I slipped in the fact that I now regarded myself as lesbian, and that being a member of a minority group gave gay and lesbian ministers an advantage when it came to doing liberation theology. I've got a feeling that some people didn't hear it, but some people did hear it, but didn't hear the rest of the paper. And I remember one of my friends going to check afterwards that I had actually meant it. And one or two others saying, well, it's nothing new. We've had women ministers who lived with other ministers in the past. We just didn't name them. Though one person did say at the end of the conference we hadn't done any proper theology, but I think that was more a reflection of liberation theology or my paper than of his attitude on sexuality. And I remember officially coming out at Golders Green as minister. Of course, by that stage, most of my friends knew anyway. But I did phone round the gay and lesbian members to tell them what I was doing, to think that they might actually lend some support on the day. The only negative comments I had was from a lesbian couple who said, please don't do it. We don't want the church to be known as a gay church. But I did it, and nobody turned a hair, really. And I thought my family were fine with it too, because Grace and I had done things with the family as a couple, and again, nobody seemed to turn a hair. But when I came to leave Golders Green in 1995, we decided we'd hold a celebration of our partnership before we left London, because that's where our friends were. And I invited some members of my family who were mainly in the north. My parents, who are now dead, urged me not to do it because it might ruin my career, something which clearly wasn't true, but they didn't realize that. And then one person said he wouldn't come because his wife disapproved, which was a bit of a blow. But I had one aunt who lived in London who, in retrospect, I had actually done a good job of supporting the black sheep in the family. But she came to the ceremony, and that was fine. And then we moved up north. My next significant involvement, I think, apart from the pink leaflet where I was named as contact, a pink leaflet called Where We Stand, Gay and Lesbian Issues and the Unitarian and Free Christian Churches. I was named as one of the contacts because we thought it was important to have a woman contact as well as a man. But very little came from that in terms of people contacting me directly. We tried to have a few fringe meetings at the General Assembly annual meetings. Very few women came. And it was impossible. We didn't manage to get a lesbian and gay group going although we did try for several years, but nothing sustainable developed. I think there was one in London for a short time, probably after I left, that was men only, but again, that didn't last. One thing of interest while I was at Golders Green, two things of interest. First of all, I did quite a lot of AIDS funerals, and it was quite moving to do funerals for people younger than myself. The other thing was the Lesbian and Gay Bereavement Project, which had been started by Dudley Cave and Bernard Williams with help from Keith Gilley and the Golders Green congregation. And that was really significant. It was a time when quite often young men died from AIDS, and their partners were not recognised by their families, so were excluded from funerals and so on. So we did, it was basically a telephone counselling service, and I think we did quite a lot of good work. I became Bernard's, I think supervisor was the technical word, though he was chair of the group, I think, and everybody had to have somebody to go to. So he came and talked to me, and that certainly helped me to understand a lot more about the sort of lives that older gay men had led. Then when I left there and moved to Manchester, I candidated for a part-time position, took my partner along, made it obvious that we were a partner, and still got the job. Job's not really quite right the word, is it? When it was still appointed a quarter-time minister. It was a small traditional congregation, and at the beginning I only did lesbian and gay blessing services elsewhere, often in people's homes or wherever they were having the party. But I carried on doing that. In London, I'd only ever done them in the church. Apart from one heterosexual one between a Jewish man and an ex-Unitarian woman, who found there were too, and the Jewish family found there were too many crosses in the church, in the plasterwork, so you couldn't remove them. So I did, that was a very big event, which I did else in a country house somewhere. That was a blessing of a union, but not a same-sex one, which is interesting. But the others, the same-sex unions, I tended to do actually in the church building. But in Manchester, I didn't to begin with. And then after a few years, I asked the committee about this, saying that they were actually missing out on a source of revenue, because weddings were quite important in terms of finance for this little congregation. And to my surprise, they agreed that I should be able to do blessings of same-sex unions on the same sort of terms that I did for heterosexual weddings. So that was interesting. But my national involvement, once I moved to Manchester, was to be part of the Sexual Orientation Equality Group, which was set up after a General Assembly resolution and produced a work pack on being a welcoming congregation to LGBTQ+ people. We had an interesting time. We were, I think, 3 men, 3 women, 3 gay, 3 straight, something like that. We had quite a difficult time in some ways, one of the things we had hoped to do was to do a questionnaire. And at a rather late stage, this was disapproved of by the General Assembly officers. With hindsight, I think they're probably right, that it would have been too difficult to administer. I remember even Keith Gilley thought that it was not the right thing to do. And he had been a great supporter of lesbian and gay matters. But we did produce, I think, quite a useful guide and workbook for the congregations. And we went round offering workshops with one gay person, one straight person. And I remember Linda Phillips and I did one. And we'd taken part in the service earlier in the day, and I had lit a candle for my daughter because it was her birthday, I think. And then when we came to do the workshop, it was evident at some stage in the questioning that people had assumed that I was the straight one because I had a daughter and Linda was lesbian, which is not the case. But it was very interesting how people couldn't tell. And I guess as the first person who was, the woman who was obviously out as a lesbian and proud of it, I felt I had a ministry just being who I was. I remember one person describing me as a very unusual sort of woman, which I'm not quite sure what that was code for. But on the whole, I found that being a minister, doing ordinary ministerial things, and being known as a lesbian did, I think it helped to destroy some of the myths about how lesbians either had to be butch or femme, which might have been true many years ago, but it's certainly not true for the past 30 years. So it seemed to me it was important just to do my ministry as well as I could and be a lesbian. Because since then, there are quite a lot of other women who are known as lesbians. And I guess people really don't bother these days. It's not a problem. It certainly wasn't a problem for me in becoming either principal of a college. Ecumenically, I think I found that people didn't mind Unitarians being lesbian. They might have been slightly more worried if their own members were lesbian. And it certainly hasn't damaged my career in the General Assembly, as my parents feared. And I guess to be the first openly lesbian minister who was made an honorary member, I think one of the reasons why I was really pleased to accept it was the fact that I would be the first open lesbian woman to accept that. So I think I've been really very lucky in having a career and a lot of my social life within the Unitarian movement.
I just wonder what you remember of the time when Section 28 was still in force. Mm-hmm. I know that in 2000, the General Assembly passed a resolution essentially calling for the repeal of Section 28. Do you remember that legislation having an impact on anything that you did? And do you remember why and how it was the repeal was called for?
I don't really have, I mean, I remember voting for the resolution, but I don't remember any direct impact that it had on me.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting.
I mean, unfortunately, at that time, I wasn't teaching in schools.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it would have been very different, I can imagine,
yeah.
for teachers at that time. That's all the follow-up questions I was going to ask, except for the 3 kind of final questions. Would you like to move on to those? Yeah.
Yeah.
So kind of thinking about the time that we've covered as a whole, in your experience, have you seen changes across that era for LGBT people? Are there any kind of big changes you can pull out of that time?
Yes, there have been enormous changes in the last, well, I guess I've been involved in the movement for nearly 70 years. That in the early parts of that stage, male homosexual acts were still illegal, although I didn't get involved later. And I think in common with the rest of society, views have changed enormously. And I'm proud that Unitarians have helped in that change. Because there are always some people who have not approved of the liberalisation of the laws, etc. And it's always a balance between free speech and justice. Yes, a lot of the change has been, I think, quite gradual. That and sometimes it's been the minority group that has seen way out, that a few years later, that becomes the majority. So yes, I'm really pleased that we have been a movement that has worked for justice and recognition of all the variety of human sexualities that there are.
Finally, what are your hopes for the future for LGBT plus people in the Unitarian movement and in society?
I hope that we go on respecting people whose sexuality may not conform to the norms. I think at the present time, there's a really difficult debate about women's safety and trans women's rights. And I see this as a real difficulty, in that it's important for people to have safe spaces, but it's important for everyone to be respected. And how we balance that out, I really do not know. I think we've got some quite tricky times ahead. But I hope that we go on exploring and learning how to value people and give us all a safe space in which to explore.